The sound was wrong. That was Colonel Jack Lance's first thought, a pilot's instinct honed over thousands of hours in the air. It wasn't the scream of a jet engine, a sound of combustion and exhaust. This was a deeper, more primal noise, a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate up from the concrete floor of the hangar, through the soles of his boots, and into his very bones. It was the sound of the sun trapped in a cage. The cage was Project Prometheus. It sat in the center of the Sector 7 hangar, a cavern carved into the Nevada mountain. It was not a plane. It was a statement of absolute power, a leviathan of polished aluminum with a wingspan that seemed to defy the very size of the hangar containing it. And at its heart, behind layers of lead and liquid sodium, a compact nuclear reactor was coming to life. Dr. Alan Mitchell stood on the observation gantry, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. This was his theory made real, his equations given form. He should feel triumph. Instead, he felt a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He watched the technicians below, small as ants against the machine's bulk. They moved with a frantic reverence, their faces illuminated by the soft, ethereal blue glow emanating from the reactor's viewports. Cherenkov, radiation, the ghost light of splitting atoms. It was beautiful, and it filled him with a physicist's dread. The test was a contained power-up. The Prometheus was shackled to the earth by massive steel cables. Today, it would not fly. Today, it would simply prove it could breathe without killing them all. In the control booth, sealed behind thick glass, the atmosphere was thick with tension and cigarette smoke. General McKellar stood with his arms crossed, his face a granite mask of impatience. Mitchell leaned into the microphone, his voice deceptively calm. Reactor at 50%. The hum deepened. A fine tremor ran through the gantry floor. Dust motes danced in the air. 75%. On the hangar floor, a young technician named Evans adjusted his helmet. He was performing a final visual inspection of the auxiliary coolant lines, a routine task. He gave a thumbs up to the control booth, a small figure against the colossal, vibrating machine. 100%. We are at full power. The sound became a physical force. The Prometheus strained against its shackles, a beast testing its chains. In the booth, men let out held breaths, their faces breaking into grins. They saw the dials holding steady. They saw the power output matching the projections. It was a success. Mitchell's eyes were locked on a separate bank of monitors, his own private nightmare. The main radiation sensors were green, but his secondary array, the one he had fought the generals to install, flickered. A single indicator for a ventilation duct near the tail assembly turned a pale, sickly yellow. A whisper of contamination. Not a leak, a seepage, a ghost escaping. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words were drowned out by a sudden, sharp, electronic chattering. It was a sound that didn't belong, a rapid, frantic clicking. Everyone in the booth froze. The grins vanished. Mitchell's eyes snapped down to the hangar floor. Technician Evans was still standing there, but he was no longer looking at the plane. He was staring at the device in his hand, a portable Geiger counter. Its needle was pinned, its audible alarm screaming a staccato warning into the cavernous space. Evans looked up, his eyes wide with confusion, then dawning horror. He wasn't looking at the reactor. He was looking directly through the control booth glass, his gaze locking with Dr. Mitchell's. In that frozen second, it wasn't a soldier and a scientist. It was one man silently asking another, "What have you done?" Then General McKellar's voice, cold and sharp as a scalpel, cut through the noise. "Kill the audio feed. Now." A switch was thrown. The frantic clicking from the hangar speakers died. On the floor, Evans was already being hurried away by two men in protective gear. The moment was erased. McKellar turned to Mitchell, his voice low, for their ears only. "A localized reading. A faulty seal. It will be noted in the report. The test was a resounding success, Doctor. Do not forget the bigger picture." Mitchell could only nod. The image of Evans's terrified face burned into his mind. He saw Colonel Lance watching him from the corner of the booth. Lance's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were active, processing everything. The success, the hidden panic, the lie. 2 weeks later, under a black, star-choked sky, the Prometheus was prepared for its first flight. The shackles were gone. It sat at the end of the runway, a dark mountain against the desert. Inside the cockpit, Lance and his co-pilot, a young captain named Miller, ran through the final checks. "Think she'll fly, Colonel?" Miller asked, trying to sound casual. Lance didn't look away from his instruments. "She's just a plane, Captain. A very heavy one." He pushed the throttles forward. The nuclear turbine hybrid screamed, and the Leviathan began to roll. The acceleration was immense, a relentless shove that pushed Lance back into his seat. The runway lights blurred into a single stream, and then, with a groan of protesting metal, the weight surrendered to lift. The Prometheus climbed into the night, a city block of potential annihilation taking to the sky. In the control tower, Mitchell watched the single red navigation light ascend until it was indistinguishable from the distant stars. He felt no pride, only the crushing weight of their ambition. He looked down at the radar screen. The blip that was Prometheus pulsed, a steady, confident heartbeat. And over the tower's tinny speakers, beneath the hiss of static and the calm voice of the radar operator, Mitchell could have sworn he heard it. The faint, phantom click, click, click of a Geiger counter. A sound now permanently etched into the silence of his soul. 1 week. That was the first milestone. 7 days and nights circling a sterile patch of the North Pacific. A monotonous eternity of cloud and sea. For the first 48 hours, a sense of giddy triumph permeated the Prometheus. They had done it. They were living inside a miracle. Colonel Jack Lance maintained a facade of rigid control, but even he felt the awe. They flew with a silence that was unnerving. No thunder of burning fuel, just the whisper of air over the wings and the deep, resonant hum of the reactor that was the ship's mechanical heartbeat. They were a ghost, invisible and eternal. Dr. Alan Mitchell spent his days buried in data, monitoring his reactor. His secondary sensor array, the one he had built in secret after the incident with technician Evans, told a different story from the official green-lit main console. It showed a gradual, insidious creep. The whisper of radiation was now a steady murmur, seeping through microscopic cracks in the shielding, contaminating the very air they recycled. The first crack in the human shield appeared on day 5. Captain Miller, the young co-pilot, started complaining of a persistent metallic taste in his mouth. He blamed the recycled water. Then he began missing simple commands, his focus drifting. Lance found him staring blankly at his navigation charts, a thin trickle of blood from his nose staining the paper. "Get to the med bay," Lance ordered. his voice low and firm. Miller just blinked. "It's nothing, Colonel. Dry air." But it wasn't nothing. The next day, 2 engineers who had spent hours working near the reactor's primary coolant pumps collapsed with violent, racking nausea. The ship's medic, a man named Riggs, was baffled. His initial diagnosis was food poisoning, but his own Geiger counter, when he finally thought to use it, chirped an alarming rhythm near the men. The color drained from his face. Lance confronted Mitchell in the cramped reactor control alcove. The hum of the machine, a constant third presence in their conversation. "It's the radiation, isn't it?" Lance's voice was a low growl, stripped of all military decorum. "Evans in the hangar. Now this." Mitchell couldn't meet his eyes. He gestured to his hidden sensors. "It's contained. Mostly. The exposure is cumulative. The shielding, it's not perfect. I need more time to recalibrate the—" "Time?" Lance cut him off, grabbing Mitchell's arm. "I have a man bleeding from his sinuses and 2 more puking their guts out in the infirmary. What part of that requires more time to understand?" Their argument was interrupted by a frantic call from the cockpit. They had missed a scheduled check-in. Command was demanding a status report. General McKellar's voice was crisp over the encrypted channel. "Prometheus, report. Is there a systems anomaly?" Lance looked at Mitchell, at the fear in the scientist's eyes. He looked down the corridor towards the sickbay. He keyed the mic, his voice betraying nothing. "Negative, Command. No anomalies. Minor environmental systems fluctuation. All systems are optimal." The lie tasted like ash. McKellar's final words were a warning. "Maintain patrol pattern. The strategic picture is deteriorating. You are the nation's shield. Do not lower it." The moment the channel closed, the ship's intercom crackled. It was Medic Riggs, his voice tight with panic. "Colonel, to the infirmary. Now." Engineer Perez, one of the 2 who had fallen ill, was having a seizure on the floor. His body convulsed, his back arching unnaturally. The other, Engineer Davison, was huddled in a corner, sobbing uncontrollably, clumps of his own hair in his hands. Riggs held up a blood sample he'd taken from Perez. He didn't need to say a word. The portable Geiger counter on his desk was screaming, its frantic, rapid-fire clicking filling the small room. The blood itself was hot. Radioactive. Lance stared at the convulsing man, at the hysterical one, at the chirping counter. This was not a systems failure. This was a plague. And they were trapped in a flying, pressurized incubator with it. He turned to Mitchell, his face a mask of cold fury and grim realization. "You built a coffin, Doctor, and you sold it to us as a throne." Engineer Perez did not survive the night. His death was not quiet. It was a brutal, undignified end in the sterile glow of the infirmary, his body racked by seizures until his heart simply gave out. The frantic clicking of the Geiger counter near his body became his funeral dirge. The corpse presented a problem more terrifying than any system failure. It was not just a body. It was a mass of radioactive waste, contaminated, unapproachable. They couldn't store it, they couldn't bury it, and the thought of ejecting it into the sea felt like a war crime waiting to be discovered. Colonel Lance made the only call he could. In the dead of their artificial night, he and Mitchell, clad in makeshift protective gear, heavy coveralls and respirators, wrapped Perez's remains in lead-lined tarps, meant for reactor maintenance. They sealed the grim package in a remote equipment bay, turning it into a tomb. The air around the bay immediately registered on Mitchell's sensors. They were storing a piece of their own hell inside the ship. The act broke the crew. The thin veneer of military discipline shattered. Whispers of plague and cursed ship snaked through the corridors. Paranoia became the third pilot on the flight deck. Men looked at each other, searching for the next sign. A cough, a nosebleed, a moment of confusion. Who would be next? Captain Miller's condition worsened. The metallic taste was now a constant burn in his throat. He developed a hacking cough that left speckles of blood on his hand. His once sharp mind was foggy, his hands trembling on the controls during his shifts. Lance had to relieve him, assigning him to simple, monitored tasks. The co-pilot's chair sat empty, a silent accusation. Mitchell became a ghost, haunting his own machine. He spent every waking moment in the reactor alcove, running diagnostics, trying to find a solution. But every calculation led to the same, chilling conclusion. The reactor's core was slowly, inexorably degrading. The neutron flux was embrittling the containment vessel. His models predicted a catastrophic failure, a core disassembly, within the next 72 hours. It wouldn't be a nuclear explosion, but a meltdown. A fire that would vaporize the ship and scatter a radioactive poison cloud across the Pacific. They were no longer a shield. They were a sword, poised to fall. He took his findings to Lance in the cockpit. The colonel was staring at the endless expanse of ocean below, his face etched with a fatigue no sleep could cure. "We have to abort the mission," Mitchell said, his voice hollow. "We have to land. Now." Lance didn't turn. "Our orders are explicit. We maintain the patrol. We are the deterrent. The deterrent is about to kill everyone on board and poison 1,000 square miles of ocean." Mitchell's composure broke, his voice rising to a desperate shout. "This isn't a mission anymore, it's a suicide pact. McKellar and the others, they knew the risks. They wrote us off the moment we took off." Lance finally turned. The stoic soldier was gone. In his place was a man cornered, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "And what happens if we disobey, Doctor? We land this thing, this flying catastrophe, on a friendly airstrip. We contaminate a whole island. We become the #1 security threat to the nation we're supposed to be protecting. They'll never let us leave that tarmac. They'll bury us with the ship." The ship's intercom buzzed, saving them from the abyss of their argument. It was Medic Riggs. His voice was a broken whisper. "Colonel, it's Miller. You need to see this." They found Miller in the mess hall. He was standing on a table, preaching to the terrified, haggard crew about angels he saw in the reactor's blue glow. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated. A thin trail of blood dripped from both ears, staining the collar of his flight suit. "He's got cerebral edema," Riggs murmured to Lance. "The radiation. It's cooking his brain from the inside." Miller pointed a trembling finger at Mitchell. "He brought the fire, the beautiful burning fire, and it's hungry for us." The crew watched, their faces a mixture of horror and grim agreement. The mutiny wasn't in their actions, but in their eyes. They had lost faith in the mission, in their commanders, in the machine. Lance moved with a terrifying, decisive calm. He didn't argue. He didn't order. He walked to the table, looked up at his former co-pilot, and in one fluid, brutal motion, he injected him with a powerful sedative from Riggs's kit. Miller's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed into Lance's arms. Lance laid him gently on the floor, then stood to address his crew. His voice was low, devoid of all emotion, a flat line of pure authority. Everyone listen closely. The next man who speaks about angels or fire will be confined to quarters. We have a situation. Dr. Mitchell believes the reactor is becoming unstable. A wave of panic passed through the men. Lance held up a hand, silencing them. Our orders from command are to stay airborne. But my primary order is to preserve the lives of my crew and the security of the United States. We are not following command's directive. He turned to Mitchell, his decision made in the crucible of madness and death. Plot me a course for the nearest suitable landing strip, the most remote, isolated piece of concrete on the planet. We are bringing this thing down. The silence that followed Colonel Lance's mutiny was heavier than any sound the Prometheus had ever made. The crew, moments from panic, now moved with the grim purpose of the condemned. There was no more debate, no more fear. Only action. Dr. Mitchell, his hands shaking not from radiation, but from adrenaline, identified their only hope. Lauren Station Tango, a decommissioned and partially dismantled refueling strip on a desolate, windswept atoll. It was a postage stamp in the ocean, its runway just long enough to be a prayer. Lance didn't ask for a vote. He input the coordinates himself. The massive bomber banked, a subtle but profound shift in its eternal course. It was no longer a sentinel. It was a falling star. They had 6 hours. For the first 3, a fragile hope took hold. Then, the Prometheus began to die. It started with the lights. A flicker in the portside corridor, then a plunge into darkness. Emergency batteries kicked in, casting a dim, blood-red glow. Mitchell, monitoring his array, watched in horror as the core temperature spiked. The neutron flux was accelerating, chewing through the last intact sections of the containment shield. "Lance, we're losing primary cooling," he shouted over the intercom. "The pumps are failing." A new sound joined the ship's deep hum, a high-pitched, metallic screech from the reactor core, like a beast in agony. On the flight deck, warning lights erupted across the panel. A fire alarm blared in the starboard engine nacelle. The radiation alarm, the one they had tried to ignore for weeks, began a continuous, ear-splitting wail. The Prometheus was screaming. Lance's voice was a rock in the storm. "I need 2 volunteers for the auxiliary pump manifold. It's a hot zone." 2 engineers, their faces pale but set, stood up without a word. They suited up in the heavy protective gear and moved aft, into the red-lit hell of the main corridor. Lance fought the controls. The ship was becoming sluggish. A whale shot through with harpoons. The starboard turbine began to surge and fade, its power output fluctuating wildly. Through the cockpit window, a thin, acrid smoke began to stream from the nacelle. Mitchell's voice was tight with panic. "Jack, the core is approaching meltdown. We have minutes, not hours." The response from the 2 volunteers came through, crackling with static and pain. "Manifold is secured. Valve is open." The transmission dissolved into a fit of wet, hacking coughs. Then silence. They had sacrificed themselves to buy a sliver of time. "Brace for impact!" Lance roared into the ship-wide intercom. "This is not a drill." The atoll appeared on the horizon, a thin gray scar on the endless blue. The runway was short, pockmarked, and littered with debris. It was a terrible landing strip. It was their only chance. Lance brought the dying Leviathan in low and fast. He could feel the controls fighting him, the hydraulics bleeding pressure. The landing gear indicator flashed a failure warning. The wheels were not locking down. "We're going in on the belly," he said to Mitchell, his voice eerily calm. Hold on! The Prometheus skimmed the choppy water, then hit the coral-reinforced concrete with a sound that defied description. A shrieking, grinding, apocalyptic roar of tearing metal. The world dissolved into a violent, shuddering chaos. Everything not bolted down became a projectile. The red emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, punctuated by the horrific sparks flying along the fuselage as it scraped itself apart. The co-pilot's chair, Miller's empty seat, ripped free from its moorings and smashed against the forward console. Lance held the yoke with all his strength, riding the beast down, trying to keep it from cartwheeling into the jungle. Finally, with a final groaning shudder, the wrecked behemoth slid to a stop. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Smoke and dust filled the air. Lance coughed, tasting blood and ozone. He unbuckled himself, his body screaming in protest. He looked at Mitchell, who was slumped in his seat, a deep gash on his forehead. Outside the shattered cockpit window, the world was still. They had made it. They were down. But then, a new sound began. A faint, insistent hissing, coming from the rear of the shattered fuselage. It was the sound of superheated steam escaping from a cracked reactor vessel. The beast was wounded, but its poisonous heart was still beating, bleeding its invisible poison into the tropical air. They had survived the fall. But the atoll was no longer a sanctuary. It was their new open-air prison. The silence on the atoll was a physical weight. It was broken by the groan of contracting metal, the hiss of escaping steam, and the frantic, ever-present clicking of the Geiger counter Colonel Lance had salvaged from the wreck. The Prometheus lay broken, a great beached metal whale, its back broken on the coral reef. A faint, shimmering haze of heat and radioactivity rose from its ruptured rear fuselage. They were 7. 7 survivors who crawled from the wreckage into a new kind of hell. The tropical sun was brutally bright, the air thick and humid. It should have felt like life. It felt like a tomb. Dr. Mitchell, his head wound, crudely bandaged, used the counter to map the contamination. His face was a mask of grim confirmation. The radiation emanating from the wreck made a wide berth necessary. The pristine beach, the lush jungle, it was all a lie. The atoll was poisoned. They were prisoners on an island that was slowly killing them. The rescue came not with a friendly hand, but with the thunder of rotors and the grim efficiency of a military operation. A team clad in bulky white hazmat suits descended from a helicopter, their faces hidden behind darkened visors. There were no words of comfort, only barked orders through muffled speakers. "Stay where you are! Do not approach!" Lance, standing as the ranking officer, tried to assert control. "My men need medical attention. We have casualties inside." "You are all contaminated," the lead figure stated, his voice devoid of humanity, a flat, electronic tone. "You will follow decontamination protocols." The protocols were a brutal, clinical stripping of their identity. Their flight suits, cut from them and sealed in lead-lined barrels. Their bodies scrubbed raw with harsh chemicals under high-pressure sprays in a temporary field unit. They were issued identical, gray, prison-like uniforms. Then, the isolation began. They were flown not to a hospital, but to a windowless, concrete bunker, deep within another secret facility. The air was filtered, the light artificial. Their new home was a series of interconnected isolation rooms, observed through thick glass panels by unsmiling men in lab coats. General McKellar visited, A ghost from their past life? He stood on the other side of the glass, clean, pressed, and untouchable. The Prometheus was a tragic accident, McKellar said, his voice cool through the intercom. A conventional fuel-air explosion during a long-range endurance test. All hands were lost. You are heroes. Silent heroes. Mitchell slammed his hands against the glass. You know what it was. The radiation. The core breach. The men we lost. McKellar's expression didn't change. There was no reactor, Doctor. There was no radiation. Project Prometheus never existed. Your survival complicates a very simple, very clean narrative. Lance stepped forward, his eyes burning with a cold fire. What about my crew? What happens to us? You are a national security asset, McKellar replied, his gaze icy. You will be cared for, monitored. Your country thanks you for your service. The door to their cell sealed with a definitive hiss. They were not saved. They were contained. Like the wreck of the Prometheus, they were a secret, too dangerous to exist. Days bled into weeks. Medical tests were constant, invasive, but never diagnostic. They were data points. Mitchell's health deteriorated rapidly. The cumulative radiation dose was claiming its final price. He spent his last days in a sterile medical bay, attached to monitors, his body failing him. Lance sat by his side, the only visitor allowed. It was supposed to be a gift, Mitchell whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Fire from the gods. I just wanted to keep us safe. You gave them a weapon, Doc, Lance said, his voice softer than it had ever been. They just didn't know it would turn on them. Mitchell's last breath was a faint sigh. There was no ceremony. Men in suits took the body away for disposal. Lance was left alone in the silence. He was eventually transferred, declared medically unfit for duty, and given a new identity. A small pension, a quiet, anonymous life under constant, discreet surveillance. The final scene is not of a man but of a machine years later. A satellite view, crisp and cold, focuses on the lonely atoll. The wreck of the Prometheus is still there, a dark scar on the coral. Around it, the ocean is a perfect, impossible blue. But as the satellite sensor shifts to a different spectrum, the truth is revealed. A massive, swirling plume of contamination bleeds from the wreck, a ghostly, spreading stain in the deep, carried by the currents. On the soundscape, we hear the gentle lap of waves, which slowly, insidiously, morphs into the relentless, unstoppable clicking of a Geiger counter. The screen holds on the poisoned sea. The ghost was not in the machine. It was what the machine left behind.